You are listening to The Standard Show, the podcast that brings you the stories behind the standards.
Hello, this is Matthew Childs and welcome to Inside AI, the EU AI Act in practice. A series from The Standard Show, the podcast that brings you the stories behind the standards. Artificial intelligence is developing at unprecedented speed, creating enormous opportunities, alongside new challenges around safety, accountability, transparency and trust. The EU AI Act represents the world's first comprehensive legal framework for AI, designed to balance innovation with the protection of fundamental rights. But how does regulation become reality? And what role does standards play in helping organisations develop and deploy trustworthy AI systems? This series takes a practical look at the journey from legislation to implementation. Across the episodes, we explore why the EU AI Act was introduced, how risk-based regulation works, how standards support compliance, and what organisations need to consider as they prepare for the new regulatory landscape. From harmonised European standards and AI assurance to quality management and risk management, the series examines the tools and approaches that will help turn AI regulation into practice. Before we get down to it, here's Cindy Parakill with a quick reminder.
Hey, just a quick reminder to follow, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. Want to get in touch or find us on socials? All the links you need are in the show notes.
This episode explores the problems the AI Act was designed to address and why it takes a risk-based approach. It also examines the role of fundamental rights, responsibilities across the AI value chain, and why standards will be essential to supporting compliance. And for it, I'm joined by Adam Leon-Smith and Beckett Leclerc. Adam Leon-Smith is one of the UK's leading experts in AI assurance, software quality and standards. He is CEO of Trustworthy Digital, Chair of the AI/QI Consortium, Deputy Chair of the UK's National AI Standards Committee, and has more than 20 years' experience in software testing, quality engineering and standards development. Adam plays a leading role in international and European AI standardization, contributing to standards including ISO IEC 42001, the world's first AI management system standard, and EN 18286, the European AI quality management standard, supporting implementation of the EU AI Act. His work focuses on helping organizations build AI systems that are trustworthy, governable, and auditable. Beckett Leclerc is an AI governance and digital policy specialist at Five Rights Foundation, where they focus on ensuring AI technologies are designed and governed in ways that protect fundamental rights. Beckett works on AI policy and implementation, with a particular focus on the EU AI Act, AI accountability, and responsible innovation. He collaborates with policymakers, standards bodies, industry, and civil society to help shape trustworthy, human-centred AI. I started by asking Adam, what problems was the EU trying to solve when it introduced the AI Act?
There were a lot of high-profile harms relating to discriminatory outcomes from automated decision-making across employment, credit, law enforcement, opaque scoring and profiling of citizens that people can't understand, things like social scoring in China, manipulative AI techniques that exploit vulnerabilities like age, disability, socioeconomic status, large-scale biometric surveillance without safeguards, and generally speaking, unsafe AI being embedded in products that are already regulated for safety. So medical devices, machinery, toys, radio equipment, etc. And all of these things were leading to an erosion of trust in AI generally, which was seen as a barrier to adoption, not just a risk to mitigate. So initially, the AI Act focused on discriminatory outcomes and all those other harms I listed from classical machine learning. But it was during the early development of the Act that I guess we had the wave of LLMs between sort of 2020 and 2023 when things changed quite a lot. So by the end, it was also trying to mitigate harms that come from systemic risk of what we now call frontier models, or general purpose AI models in the language of the AI Act.
I mean, AI has become something that's sort of part of the sort of national, international conversations now. I'm just wondering about the approach that the EU took. Why did they choose a sort of a risk-based approach rather than trying to regulate specific AI technologies?
So, the risk-based approach is sometimes misleading, actually, because some people think that means they assess the risk of their systems and determine whether they're regulated. And to a large degree, the regulated cases are written in the law by the legislator. And that's particularly true of things that have an impact on what's called fundamental rights, or you might know as human rights. Now, they took an approach of defining the use cases there that are high risk. There is also a whole range of products that just because they're regulated for safety by other regulation, they fall into scope as well. So those define what's called the high-risk AI systems, but it's important to understand they are defined for you. There is not a risk assessment that you need to do. There's also systems that are prohibited. These are ones that you could be said to be posing an unacceptable risk. Social scoring, manipulative techniques, some real-time biometric identification in public. And those are just banned. So again, there's no real risk assessment to do there. The regulator's done it for you. And then there is limited risk. So this is where obligations about transparency apply. It's about users knowing that they're interacting with AI or AI-generated content. And a key thing here is just because these obligations apply, and you will hear this called limited risk, that doesn't mean the high-risk obligations don't also apply. It's not exclusive. So your system can be both high risk and limited risk, which is extremely confusing. And then there's what's called minimal risk systems with no legal obligations in the law. And that concept doesn't exist in the law because there's no legal obligations. So the analogy of a risk-based approach can actually be quite confusing. It doesn't relate to the scope of what is regulated. But if you get into actually applying the law to a high-risk AI system, it then does become risk-based, based on the use case you've identified and the actual risks that are posed to health, safety, and fundamental rights. You have to try and mitigate through the design and development of the system.
Adam mentioned the issue of fundamental rights, and a defining feature of the EU AI Act is its focus on protecting these fundamental rights. Rather than regulating technology for its own sake, the Act is designed to reduce the risk that AI systems could negatively affect people's rights and freedoms. This is particularly important in high-impact areas such as recruitment, employment, education, healthcare, and access to public services, where AI-assisted decisions can have significant consequences for individuals. To explore what this means in practice, I spoke with Beckett Leclerc from the Five Rights Foundation. I began by asking, what are fundamental rights and why are they so central to the legislation?
When we talk about fundamental rights, we're usually talking about the human rights that are inherently owed to all people everywhere in the world, so regardless of who they are or where they're from. The phrase fundamental rights is often used quite interchangeably with human rights, but it's often the favoured phrase when we're talking in specific EU contexts. And importantly, those rights are indivisible and interdependent, with no single most important right that wins out over all the others or something like that. Now, fundamental rights are set out in international laws, treaties, and so on, and specific to the EU context, there is the Charter of Fundamental Rights and also the European Convention on Human Rights, the latter of which all member states are party to. These rights are critical to the AI Act because governments are obliged to protect and promote such rights as part of their jobs. And data-driven and algorithmic technologies, the ones we commonly call AI now, are increasingly embedded into daily life and can have quite considerable impacts on rights, and in particular could pose severe risks to fundamental rights if they're not designed responsibly. So, for example, one we often talk about is algorithmic surveillance, and that risks violating some rights and having severe chilling effects on others. And this is particularly true for vulnerable groups, including youth and children. So essentially, if the AI Act is to fulfill the goals that it was set out to achieve, fundamental rights have a really key role to play.
And in terms of in practice for organisations then, how about, what does it mean if organisations are using in AI in areas such as sort of recruitment and employment? What does that mean in practice for them?
So to begin with, organizations do need to have sufficient critical AI literacy among their workforces. So it's no longer good enough to just deploy any old system and absolve yourself of responsibility entirely. Organizations also need to be able to understand enough to transparently disclose and explain the presence of certain systems, such as chatbots, which are, for example, increasingly common across recruitment, education, many other contexts. And there are also certain use cases which are just off limits due to the likelihood of severe rights impacts. Now, this includes things like purposeful deception and manipulation, or exploitation of vulnerabilities like health, marginalization, age, etc. Then there are some use cases which aren't forbidden but are risky enough to fundamental rights to require strict obligations to mitigate the risks to those rights. So there's a few use cases here that are maybe quite relevant for employment, like the use of recruitment tools and employee workplace evaluations. When it comes to high-risk contexts, organizations have to consider fundamental rights through many lenses, such as data provenance, human oversight of the system, cybersecurity, keeping records, non-discriminatory outcomes, and so on. And some systems will also require a conformity assessment to ensure that they meet AI Act requirements. Now, this does sound like a lot for organizations, but the majority of those obligations do actually fall to the developers. However, like I said previously, the deploying organization also needs to act responsibly to fulfill their requirements. So it's spreading out the load where everyone has a part to play in respecting fundamental rights throughout the entire AI lifecycle, from the initial idea conception through to decommissioning and everything in between.
Beckett, you mentioned their high risk. Now, the Act introduces fundamental rights impact assessments for certain high-risk AI systems. What are they, when are they required, and why are they important?
So fundamental rights impact assessments are structured evaluations of the possible rights impacts. They are required of deployers in most circumstances, like you said, involving systems that the AI Act classifies as being high risk. This involves assessing specific risks of harms to the rights of people or groups of people in light of the context and the information which the developer should have provided to you, describing the mitigation measures and the possible avenues for redress if something does still go wrong. And the AI office has been tasked with maintaining templates to make things more straightforward for deployers, so they're not completely in the dark when it comes to completing these assessments. The concept of doing risk assessments obviously should not be new to most organizations, but fundamental rights might be a novel topic of interest to some of them, and this is where guidance can really play a role. Fundamental rights impact assessments, I would say, are very, very important in the Act because of just the enhanced risk new systems are bringing about due to factors like opacity or bias amplification. And the risks often materialize most severely for vulnerable groups like minors, migrants, people with disabilities, and so on. And their fundamental rights as human beings cannot really be seen as a trade-off or a cost for reckless deployment. The AI Act is about respecting rights and promoting healthy innovation, and innovation is truly healthy when it enhances our ability to enjoy our rights rather than erodes them, and that holds true for everyone in society.
Standards affect all of us, every day, everywhere. By defining good practice, they help people and organizations do things better. Each year, standards bodies publish thousands of standards, and we're always looking for more people like you to join our growing community of standards makers. We welcome applicants from all backgrounds, areas of expertise, and career stages. Our goal is simple: to bring a balance of perspectives to the table. As a standards maker, you can help improve how things are made and done, whether it's building more inclusive workplaces, improving healthcare, advancing AI governance, accelerating climate action, and much more. If you want to make a difference and help shape the world through standards, start your standards making journey today. Details on how to get involved are in the show notes.
So, Adam, who has responsibilities here under the EU AI Act, and how do those responsibilities differ across the AI value chain?
That's a good question, and something a lot of people are confused about. The AI Act is built upon the new legislative framework, which is product safety law. So it is a legal framework that was certainly initially designed to apply to physical goods, but over the years has been expanded to apply to software and all sorts of digital devices as well. So the architecture of the roles in the supply chain originates from that legal framework. So what is normally called a manufacturer is actually called a provider in the AI Act. So that is a entity that builds a system or places the system or model on the market, or they put it into service internally inside their own company. That carries the heaviest obligations. So you have responsibilities about how you design and develop the system, the quality management system you have in place, the technical documentation you have to produce, the conformity assessment procedures and registration procedures you need to follow. But there is also another role called a deployer, and this is an organization that uses an AI system under its authority in a professional context. So it's likely to be another business. So you have one business that has developed or is reselling a modified AI system, and you have an entity that is buying it and deciding to use it. Those deployers are distinct from the actual natural persons who might be engaged in using the system on a day-to-day basis. And then you have other roles like importers and distributors that are people that sit within the supply chain and have administrative, not technical, but administrative obligations. You have authorized representatives who are EU representatives for non-EU providers. And a bit like I said, the risk categories can overlap. They aren't exclusive. These roles are also not exclusive. You can hold multiple roles simultaneously. So you need to answer the question of whether you're a provider, and you also need to answer the question of whether you're a deployer for all of the systems that you're involved with.
Adam, you mentioned general purpose AI at the beginning. Why does this require a different regulatory approach?
So these models are the ones that are trained on a vast amount of data capable of competently performing a whole range of tasks, regardless of how they're placed on the market. These are regulated separately from AI systems. So if you think about the big model providers nowadays, you often go into a website or use some kind of agentic harness in order to access them. You're dealing with a system there, not a model, because it has that interface. GPI models are models that are distributed without that interface, and people integrate other systems with them. They might be distributed as a binary file, or they might be distributed as an API. It doesn't really matter. But there are two actors that are regulated: the provider of the model and the provider of the system. Once you have fallen into the category of a provider of a GPI model, you have certain obligations, which are relatively minimal unless you trigger what's called the systemic risk obligations. Now, systemic risk means something that the regulator can update sort of a list of regularly, but it also by default means anything that is trained over a certain amount of floating point operations. That is about half of what it takes to train ChatGPT, for example. It means if you're in the category of you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to train a new version of your model, you automatically fall under systemic risk. These providers have additional duties. They have to do independent model evaluation, adversarial testing, incident reporting, and take certain cybersecurity measures. And this is a very interesting part of the law from a temporal perspective, because the enforcement powers kick in on the 2nd of August 2026. So it's quite topical. And that is separate from the high-risk AI systems timeline, which has been reported a lot recently as being delayed.
There's another acronym here, Adam, that many listeners will be familiar with, GDPR. I just wonder what lessons from GDPR influenced the design of the AI Act.
Yeah, so I can only speculate there, but I can certainly make a number of points. The first one is, as I often say, we're still debating what informed consent means and how it should be implemented. quite a long time after having passed and implemented GDPR across Europe. And I think one of the lessons that was taken away from that was that actually the reliance on technical standardization to provide conformant mechanisms of complying with the law actually has a lot of benefit in a very technical area. GDPR was a prescriptive law. The AI Act, as I said before, sits within the new legislative framework where providers can opt to use a pre-approved technical standard, which provides presumption of conformity with the law. So it cuts out a lot of that kind of waiting for court decisions or data protection boards or DPAs to issue guidance over the course of a decade. I would say another point is that it is more flexible than GDPR in that providers can select their own technical solutions. They don't have to use the harmonized standards. They can use different standards. They can use different approaches. They can work with state-of-the-art techniques. Another key difference is in enforcement. So when you have a problem with GDPR, you have like one data protection authority that can help you. When you're dealing with AI systems, you have a huge ecosystem of market surveillance authorities. I think there's more than 2,000 market surveillance authorities likely to have powers to investigate AI systems. So there's a much more flexible enforcement infrastructure, and that's partly because you have like people who specialize in toys who are going to be going around toy shops looking for dangerous products, and now they're looking for toys with AI in as well. So that's why there's so many organizations. So
Adam, we talked broadly about the problems that the EU was trying to solve when it introduced the AI Act, and some of the issues here around sort of risk categories and the risk management approach. Just wonder if the role of standards here, broadly, what role why are standards important in this space?
AI has no borders. So we have to try and work internationally to come up with standard approaches that mean that we have safe systems, reliable systems, and that we have free trade in those systems across those borders. Now, standards represent an agreed way of doing things, something that's been agreed by lots of experts and through the national delegation principle, which means that they represent the views of all the represented countries in ISO, IEC, and CENELEC. So there's a lot of power in that document, not because of the number of pages or words in the PDF, but the consensus that has generated that PDF. That consensus has a large value legally. Judges will usually defer to something that has been agreed by a large set of technical experts through a robust governance process, for example. Regulators and national governments can also place certain weight on that. In some of the state laws we're starting to see emerge in the US, the sort of safe harbor or protection clauses that reference international standards, particularly ISO IEC 42001, the NIST risk management framework, and standards are starting to have some legal value there, as well as, of course, in Europe. In a world where there is a huge amount of competition over such a rapidly rising technology, having agreed ways of doing things between states is really the only way forward to ensure global use of AI is responsible.
Thank you to our guests Adam Leon Smith and Beckett Leclerc for generously sharing their expertise and insights for this episode. And special thanks to BSI colleague Joy Tan for her invaluable support in developing this series. To find out more about the themes raised in this episode, other episodes in the series, and about how to get involved in standards, then follow the links in the show notes. And the show notes are also where you can find details of our socials and all the other ways to get in touch with us here on The Standard Show.
You have been listening to an episode of The Standard Show, the podcast that brings you the stories behind the standards.
You just heard a Stripped Media production.